Hello and welcome to the 2021 Sherman Family Emerging Scholar Lecture. Today we welcome and congratulate this year's award winner, Dr. Aram Herr. We look forward to her presentation on Korea's changing national story and democratic future. I want to thank all of you for tuning in today. My name is Tom Byrne, and I am the President and CEO of the Korea Society. The annual award and lecture is now in its 5th year. The goal is to advance U.S. thought leadership on Korea-related topics. The series is made possible by the generosity of Mr. and Mrs. Phil and Brigitte Sherman, who are with us today. We encourage you to check out the 4 previous presentations on our website, which have covered maritime security in Northeast Asia, architecture in post-war Korea, Pansori Mountain pilgrimages, and the DMZ as a productive territory. I will shortly hand over the screen to our first Sherman Scholar Award winner, Dr. Katrin Katz, who is a professor at Columbia University and an adjunct fellow at CSIS Korea Chair. Katrin will present Aram's academic biography. But before that, I also wanted to acknowledge the other participants in today's program. Following Dr. Her's presentation, we are fortunate to have commentary by Dr. David Kong, who is director of the Korean Studies Institute at the University of Southern California. Thank you, Dave, for all your good work in promoting academic inquiry on Korea and for your support to the Korea Society. We will welcome your questions, so please send these now and throughout the program to policy@koreasociety.org. Policy Director Jonathan Corrado will help convey these questions later in the program. After the audience Q&A, the Korea Society Senior Director, Dr. Stephen Noerper, alongside Jonathan, will present the award to Dr. Herr. Stephen has done a tremendous job in developing the Sherman Family Lecture Series since its inception, so we thank him for helping to make today possible. Katrin, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tom. It is my great honor to introduce this year's Sherman Family Korea Emerging Scholar Lecture awardee, Dr. Aram Herr, currently an assistant professor at the University of Missouri with a joint appointment at the Truman School of Public Affairs. As Tom mentioned, Dr. Herr is the 5th recipient of this award, made possible by the generosity of the Sherman family. And I would also like to echo Tom in acknowledging the virtual presence of Phil and Brigitte Sherman. We are so happy to have you here with us today. While it would have been ideal to be gathering in the beautiful offices of the Korea Society on the 24th floor of at 350 Madison Avenue in New York City, we are grateful for the technical capabilities and the hard work of the Korea Society's support team that have allowed us to gather virtually this afternoon in the midst of the ongoing pandemic. I also want to welcome and acknowledge family members, friends, and colleagues of Dr. Herr who are here virtually and surely would have joined in person to hear her insights and celebrate her great achievements this afternoon. We are so happy to gather with you today. Today, Dr. Herr will discuss Korea's changing national story and democratic future, addressing Korean nationalism, a rapidly fragmenting and changing national story, and the danger of democratic rollback. In her work on this topic and the broader research agenda that she has built over the past several years, Dr. Herr asks questions that have immediate, and I would argue urgent relevance in gaining a deeper understanding of critical issues across a number of dimensions on the Korean Peninsula, in the region, and around the world. Dr. Herr's work on the origins and future of South Korean democracy, and more generally, on the relationship between nationalism and democracy, between national narratives and civic duty, and on the concept of nationalism, help us to address important present-day issues that are puzzling to media pundits, such as, why would South Korea's current progressive administration take a step like banning the launching of anti-North Korea leaflets across the border? Dr. Herr's research also offers a fresh lens for addressing broader questions that animate discussions concerning regional and international order, such as, are democracies or autocracies better at handling pandemics or at governing more generally? And is nationalism good or bad for democracy? I am not sure how much Dr. Herr will delve into the details of her research design today, but I also want to note that her current book project, which I've had the pleasure of hearing her discuss in recent podcasts and panels online, is also groundbreaking in its methodological approaches. As she has discussed, identifying and isolating causal connections between national narratives and the political behavior of individuals in democracies is extremely difficult because intrinsic motivations tied to national stories cannot be directly observed or manipulated. The attention devoted in her research design to overcoming these longstanding methodological challenges will surely help to guide future research for other scholars focused on nationalism and democracy in East Asia and beyond. By way of recognition of Dr. Herr's formal biography and professional accomplishments, which are many, Dr. Aram Herr, as I noted previously, joined the Department of Political Science and the Truman School of Public Affairs jointly at the University of Missouri as an assistant professor in 2019. She also importantly serves as co-director for the MU Institute for Korean Studies. Previously, Dr. Herr was a provost postdoctoral fellow at New York University and a 2018 to 2019 US Korea Next Gen Scholar selected by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. On a side note, I was honored to be in the same cohort with Dr. Herr during that year of the US Korea Next Gen Scholar Program and had the pleasure of being able to spend time with Dr. Herr. And so I can attest that on top of being absolutely brilliant, she is also a lot of fun to be around. Dr. Herr holds a Ph.D. from Princeton University, an MPP from the Harvard Kennedy School, and a BA from Stanford University. Her work is published widely in academic journals such as the British Journal of Political Science, Comparative Politics, and the Journal of East Asian Studies. And it is also frequently cited in media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Foreign Policy. Dr. Herr, I very much look forward to hearing your lecture today. It is my great honor to introduce you, without further ado, to Dr. Aram Herr.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for that incredibly gracious introduction. You know, it's such an honor to be here today. There are so many rising Korea scholars whom I, really deeply admire. And so, my genuine thanks to the Korea Society, the Sherman family, Stephen Noerper for, seeing value in this work. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So today's lecture is about Korea's changing national story and democratic future. But I want to start with a more personal story. So we all have that kind of first political memory that, that's kind of seared into our minds and hearts about what politics is. And mine was this. So this is 1997 in the middle of the Asian financial crisis during the national gold drives. And I remember watching, this just in total awe as citizens were lined up in incredibly cold January to essentially donate things like their wedding rings, family heirlooms, any kind of personal gold that they had in order to save the state that was going financially bankrupt. And I remember thinking, such sacrifice could really only be described as impressive acts of civic duty, right? The voluntary sense of duty or obligation that people feel to be a good citizen, even when it hurts themselves to do so, even when it's costly. But I remember asking myself, why did so many South Koreans seem to feel that? Now, since this crisis, Korean democracy was only 10 years old at the time, Korea's democracy has come a long way. But its image as sort of this, beacon success story of the third way of democratization has recently come under question. We're seeing illiberal forms of partisan competition, as well as sort of the beginnings of tribalism intensify. And South Korea is certainly not alone in this. Democracies around the world currently, from Hungary to Myanmar, and even to the United States, once thought to be immune from these kinds of forces, are showing signs of democratic regress. But what's kind of particular about this contemporary form of democratic backsliding is that it's not really an outright coup. It's not being pressured by external threat. Rather, it's being fueled by kind of us versus them politics that are rising from within, between partisans, between classes, between religious sects. And the causes of democratic backsliding are many, but scholars of democracy generally agree that the last bastion of defense lies with the people, right? Their willingness to uphold democratic responsibility before partisan or group interests, their willingness to be good citizens, even when it's costly to do so. In short, what we need is more civic duty. So then the question is, well, where does this elusive civic duty come from, right? Why did so many South Koreans back in '97 feel it toward their very young democracy? Is this something that we can grow? And my lecture answers these questions today, drawing on research in my forthcoming book, Narratives of Duty, How National Stories Shape Civic Duty, currently under contract at Cornell University Press. So civic duty is typically, when we think about or talk about it, is kind of seen as a given aspect of culture. Given aspect of culture, character, or even something that kind of comes naturally with the maturity of a democracy. And surely these factors all matter to a certain extent. But my argument today is that civic duty is actually mostly the result of national politics. Now, I know for the audience, this might strike you as kind of a surprising thing to say. I mean, most of the common images of nationalism and democracy that we see today are things like these, and this, right? That's India. Nationalism has earned quite a reputation for tearing democracies apart. But when we think about what nationalism is, right, what gives it sort of its emotive and political power, what nationalisms are actually made of at a granular level, it's actually the stories that sustain them. Right? And as I'll show today, these national stories can weaken, but also incredibly strengthen democracies. So what are national stories exactly? National stories, if you want to think about it kind of as the folklore of the national people. So national stories exist at the level below sort of canonized, permanent myths, but above the level of a personal anecdote. They're the stories that are passed down through generations about what happened to the national people, what challenged us, what crises threatened us, who stood with us versus betrayed us in our times of need, and how we as a people learned to persevere. So for example, many in this virtual room have heard from our parents, right? Or if you're a little bit younger, your grandparents, about what it was like to actually live through the Korean War, right? How families were suddenly split, how the Northern soldiers came down and confiscated all the family land, how many of them carried their baby siblings for days on foot in order to escape, right? These stories are not explicitly pedagogical at all, but they do teach important information about national friends and foes, and what, if anything, we owe to each of those groups as a member of a particular nation. And that is why national stories are so powerful, right? These narratives are the cultural frameworks in which individuals interpret their social situations, imagine themselves in other situations, and make choices about who they want to be, what kind of national member they want to be, and how to behave towards others. And one of the key relationships that are embedded in national stories is that between the national people and the state in which they live. And based on people's lived experiences with that state, national stories provide answers to questions like, does this state represent my nation or that of a national other? Right? Does it aim to protect the best interests of my national people, or does it threaten them? And when the answer to those questions is this mutually committed relationship between the nation and the state, then the seemingly sort of innate sense of duty that many people feel to their national communities extends towards the state. It becomes inclusive of the state, driving a sense of civic political duty to care and sacrifice for that state. Now, South Korea's well-known ethnic Tanil Minjok narrative, Tanil Minjok meaning literally that all Koreans are seen as, being descended from the same bloodline, has long been this rare positive force behind civic duty and therefore its democracy for this very reason. And so, however natural the ethnic narrative might feel today to most Koreans, this was actually a relatively modern invention developed by nationalist leaders, kind of as a survival response to Japanese colonialism. So by locating the nation's identity in the bloodline of the people, it allowed the Korean nation to survive intact, even if it wasn't politically autonomous under the Japanese. And you can see here in this quote from Lee Kwang-soo, a prominent nationalist at the time, this sort of immutability of Koreanness, right? Koreans cannot but be Koreans, no matter what language of foreign nation you speak, what clothes you wear, what customs you follow, in order to become non-Korean. This is something that is in the blood, right? Now, what this also did after independence from Japan was that it bound ethnically Korean citizens and the newly independent Korean state as if part of the same body, as part of the same sort of extended family and bloodline, right? And even through sort of the tumultuous period of anti-state protests during the late 1970s, all through the 1980s until eventual democratization, the Minjung movement framed its push for democracy not as sort of breaking apart the existing nation-state relationship, but really as an effort to restore or recover its original pure form, where the true national people are represented by the state. So even through regime change, through an authoritarian regime into democracy, South Korea's ethnic national narrative continued to tie the national people to the democratic state, and to this day sustains strong levels of civic duty to it. So let me show you some data on this from the book. So the first set of data come from a nationally representative sample of over 2,000 South Korean citizens from a survey conducted by Seoul National University. This is back in 2012. So these are regression plots that show the binary relationship between strength of national identification there on the x-axis and two common forms of civic duty. Right, the sense of duty to vote and the sense of duty to pay honest taxes, two forms of civic duty that most democracies share and all democracies need. And this is that relationship for those who are statistically savvy in the room, after controlling for sort of other factors like trust, level of trust in government, interpersonal trust, collective values, political interest, as well as a pretty exhaustive range of demographics like gender, age, education, etc. Now, what you see here, as you would expect for a democracy with a strong national basis for civic duty, is a clear positive relationship, right? For voting, strong national identification is really the difference here between someone whose sense of civic duty to vote is essentially a coin toss, a little better than a flip of a coin, to what is virtually a given thing, right? And then for taxes, civic duty to pay honest taxes is already high, given that this is also legally mandated, but strong national identification still takes that to what is almost a near certainty, right? Now, I know some of you are in the audience wondering, well, that's great, but does stronger civic duty actually lead to more action, more sacrifice for the state? Because isn't that what we ultimately care about? So now let me show you some experimental data from the field that tests exactly that, right? So this experiment was run back in 2013 in partnership with the National Election Commission of South Korea around a pilot test that they were conducting of a new mobile voting application. So they were holding this pilot election essentially to test this new technology. And I asked them if I could design this experiment around that. So participants were divided into control and treatment groups. All participants received this email, which had directions for how to use the mobile voting app to actually vote with it. And everybody received this the day before their assigned pilot election day. Now, the treatment, which is the bolded text, encouraged participants to vote by explicitly priming it as a duty to the nation. And as you can see here, really highlighting its relationship to the South Korean democratic state. Our forefathers' sacrifices helped make our nation the democracy it is today. It is our duty to the Korean nation to vote and do our part. And here are the results of that study. Now you can see that the treatment message increased the sense of civic duty to vote here by 13 percentage points. Right? An actual turnout, which we were able to track anonymously using the mobile numbers because it was a mobile election, by 6 percentage points. How big is that? That is a substantial treatment effect as far as turnout experiments go, especially if you think about the fact that most high-level national elections are won or lost by usually less than 3 percentage points. This is a meaningful, big increase by just priming people's national obligation. Right? So what these data together show you is that, up to the early 2010s, South Korea's high level of civic duty is for the most part a nationally sustained phenomenon. Now, before I move on to the next point, I want to emphasize that this isn't because of some blinding or irrational quality of ethnic nationalism, which is a common thing that's sort of always pegged to Korea's nationalism. So in the book, for example, I look at neighboring democracy Taiwan, where what started as a similarly ethnic Taiwanese nationalism developed a very different kind of oppositional, not mutually supported, but oppositional relationship to the Kuomintang-controlled pro-China state. And in the data shows very different patterns where it fails to serve as this powerful basis for civic duty to its democracy today. So it's not really the definitional content of the nation, the who we are, but really the relational context of that nationalism to the state that houses it. And national stories are the stories that do the work of delineating those relationships. It's really that matters for civic duty. Now, the issue is that once powerfully unifying national story is rapidly fragmenting in South Korea, and two cross-cutting pressures are really challenging it. The first is a growing class inequality. So this graph is from the World Inequality Database, and it shows that since the early 2000s, the top 1% in Korea account for about 1/4 of the country's total wealth, while the bottom 50% only accounts for about 2% of it. Right? So as the well-known sort of East Asian state developmental model, that fell apart after the Asian financial crisis. It gave way to economic liberalization. And what it did was it left Korean laborers who had since been sort of protected from global competition vulnerable to increased global demand for cheaper Chinese manufacturing labor, and eventually edged the Korean laborers out of that global market. And so since then, unemployment and a widening income gap between the haves and have-nots has really emerged as an important social cleavage in a way that it hasn't before in South Korean society. Now, at the same time, South Korea has a looming demographic crisis. Korea's fertility rate, which falls under 1, so this means that the average woman is more likely to not have any children in her lifetime than to have a child, is the lowest and has been the lowest among OECD countries for several years. Now, the issue beyond sort of the obvious economic stagnation issues that this poses is that it saddles a shrinking young generation with the burden of providing welfare for now what is an oversized aging population. And it all but necessitates, because of those issues, immigration, interracial marriage, literally changing the ethnic face of Korea. And now, in response, South Koreans appear to be increasingly divided on their beliefs about who we should be. So these survey data are from the East Asia Institute. This wonderful graphic was compiled by the Carnegie Endowment, with which I have a piece coming out in a compendium in a few weeks, and they graciously gave me permission to use this. You can see here that support for a ethnically homogenous vision of Korea versus sort of a multicultural vision of Korea remains, roughly sort of a little bit more than half and half split. But most tellingly, between 2010 on the left side and then a decade later, 2020, people who answered, I don't know, increased by more than 10 percentage points. It went from 2% of the population to 13% of the population of saying, I really don't know what it should be. So what you see here is sort of significant kind of national fragmentation, national confusion of what sort of the guiding storyline should be and how to think about who we are. Now, the issue is not whether an ethnic story is better than a multicultural story or vice versa. I wish it were that simple, but it's not, right? When what used to be a unified national story starts to fragment like this, the problem is that it starts to fracture that nation-state relationship for groups that feel excluded. So for a lot of working class Koreans, it's not just the relative deprivation coming from the severity of inequality, but it's a deeper sense of being carved out of the nation's economic success that they helped sacrifice to build through the 1980s, right? For many native Koreans, it's not just xenophobia, as easy and tempting as it is to kind of paint that story. So this picture is from the protests against the Yemeni refugees that was widely described as sort of, xenophobic response to foreigners in a lot of the international media. But look closely at the protest signs, right? These protests are actually about feelings of deprioritization by the state. You can see there, 국민이 먼저다, right? 국민 동의 없이. These are all saying, you did not, citizens first, right? Native citizens first. So it's really, what's really driving this kind of response is the feeling of being left behind as the state devotes increasing tax dollars to multicultural programs, especially as social welfare protections still remain quite thin for what they regard as the quote unquote real Koreans. So what's happening in both cases is both kinds of feelings of alienation lead to this growing belief that the democratic state in which I live no longer represents me, right? Represents the interests of a national other. And that kind of belief, that fracturing of nation-state relationship comes with real democratic costs. So the first thing is that it weakens this powerful identity basis for civic duty that I've talked about, thereby weakening a key political resource for Korea's democracy. But what also happens is when you have the loss of a generalized attachment to the democratic state, it starts to incentivize citizens to behave as partisans first, or my group interests first, and then Democrats with a small d second. In other words, it starts to breed kind of fertile ground for the rise of populist leaders, demagogues, who are expert at capitalizing on those kinds of feelings of alienation from the state. And this starts to threaten Korea's democracy in very serious ways. And we've seen this already play out in other democracies across the world today. So in closing, I want to highlight most discussions about Korea's democratic future in policy circles tends to focus on the external threats in the region. Understandably so, pressure from nuclear North Korea and incredibly sort of increasingly aggressive Japan that's starting to find and fight for its place in the regional politics once more, and sort of China's seemingly unstoppable rise. These are all things that do put pressure on South Korea. But what this lecture hopefully did is it urges us to shift the gaze inward a bit. toward the novel identity challenges that South Korea faces going into the 21st century, and how that starts to really shake up an important civic foundation to its democracy. So South Korean democracy, as I see it, and its so far very strong and impressive civic foundation, stands at a critical juncture. The good news is that, like any kind of story, national stories are something that can be reimagined, can be rewritten. And this isn't just sort of abstract wishful thinking. States are one half of the nation-state relationship, and they hold a great deal of political agency to actually shape how people see that relationship through political leadership and smart public policies. Now, the key for South Korea as it kind of navigates this transitional moment will be to make sure that inclusive policies towards newcomers don't end up alienating or threatening native citizens who still identify with that old narrative. So, you're asking, okay, well, then what's the solution? Well, policies that dovetail incentives for both groups, and programs and centers that focus on building not only bonding social capital within groups. So this is, classic multicultural center for foreign wives in South Korea, where they learn a lot of the Korean customs. And that can be a great bonding experience within the group of foreign wives. But what we really need is to start to try to build bridging social capital, where foreign wives start to do activities with natives and locals to build identity bridges that go across these groups. These are all promising starts toward building a broadly inclusive national story, which South Korea will need in order to navigate through this and secure itself a strong democratic future going forward into the 21st century. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Herr. Really fascinating, and definitely lots to chew on here in terms of applicability to other countries, not just South Korea. Your presentation has provoked a lot of thoughts within me, and I'm sure our viewers feel the same way, so I do encourage them. Please go ahead and send in your questions to policy@koreasociety.org. We already have a bunch of questions in, and we'll try to address as many as we can. But before we get to that, we are lucky to be joined by Professor David Gang. He's director of the Korean Studies Institute at the University of Southern California. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Gang. We look forward to your commentary. Now over to you.
Thanks for having me. Thanks to the Korea Society for this awesome, wonderful program that helps to generate and highlight our young scholars. Particularly thanks to Aram for an awesome talk. It's so great to see you, and that you're doing well. So in many ways, I'm delighted to be here. I'll try and be as short as possible because there are many people who are watching. But this is fabulous research, and it's also really important for policy or for us as public intellectuals to understand what's going on in Korea. Because I think the main point that Aram's talking about that I take away from this is that at any stage of where we are looking at what Korea is, it's changing, and there is a deep national conversation going on, debate, whatever you want to call it, about what it means to be Korean. And we're doing that in the United States, we're doing that in other countries, but it's important to remember that we're doing that in Korea. And I want to start by saying, Aram's first, this is showing how old I am and how young Aram is. Her first memory is the IMF crisis. It's like, wow, but I remember the conversations before then, right? And the way that sort of Koreans thought of themselves as like Han and poor and weak, those are gone. That part is gone as well. Koreans don't view themselves that way anymore. It's viewed as sophisticated and an awesome country to visit, which when my friends, say, some people haven't been to Korea, say, oh, it's such a great place to visit. I'm like, wow, things have changed because it used to be really, really tough. So yes, the conversation is changing. What is so important about Aram's work is to point out that what we take for a given or consolidated or finished project isn't the case in terms of democratic governance. That you can think about any country, particularly we're seeing this in the United States, but we're seeing it in Korea as well. Wow, we were worried about democracy. I wasn't sure what was going to happen in 87, 88. Hey, we had a couple elections, everything's fine. And we're finding that no, that's not the case, right? This is a project, democracy or governance is a project that we have to keep investing in and that is constantly changing. What I find so interesting about the Korean case, particularly the South Korean case, is that there were two things that were going on. I'll try and be short because there are so many interesting things. There used to be, we used to say that South Korean politics had no issues discussed at all. It was all personal politics. That was decades ago, right? It was all personality politics. The parties are all personality politics. What we see today is clearly we have progressive and conservative elements. We have differences based on views of what Korea should be or what it should do emerging. And that's a good thing in a way, that we're moving from pure personality politics to an issue about what does it mean to be Korean? Should we be multicultural? Where should these resources go? And in that sense, it's a healthy discussion. They should be having this discussion. The different part is, or the more perhaps more worrisome part is, as Dr. Hush points out, much of the conversation seems to be becoming more nativist, less democratic, less concerned with the country as a whole, and much more concerned with sort of partisan issues. I'm not really sure which way that will go, but it is fascinating to watch how Korea has been behaving and how in many ways where Korea is today is sort of unthinkable even 10 years ago, as she said. If we had said back in 2010, this is where Korea will be, I don't think any of us would have believed it, right? That's no way, right? It's more stable in some ways, and yet it's also more unstable in other ways. So I will stop there, but I just want to say I think this is fascinating research. And Aram's one of the people who's paid so much attention to this that we're getting some great insights in ways that we hadn't before. So I just think this is fabulous research.
Thank you so much, Professor Gong. And I'll open up a space here. Aram, if you wanted to respond to that, if you had any thoughts following up on that, or if not, we could just proceed directly to the audience questions. How do you feel, Aram?
Yeah, I can say a few things about that. You know, I think Professor Kang's point about democracy as an ongoing process rather than a destination. A political scientist, Dan Slater, recently had something on this as well. And, you know, this has been sparked by sort of broader patterns beyond just within South Korea, but democracies around the world of signs of regress in places that we really thought that was impossible, right? And so it sparked new questions about, you know, democratization not as an end state, but a constant thing that you need to work on. And when people think about those things, though, when we talk about sort of strong versus weak democracies, the conversation still very much focuses on sort of the formal aspects, formal institutions. Has there been party turnover? You know, is there electoral fraud? And those are, you know, those are very important factors. But hopefully, I think what my research starts to highlight is that there are very important informal roots. Foundations that sustain democracies, like civic duty, right? Civic duty, when I started studying it, I think people kind of thought, hey, it's a nice thing to have, you know, talk about it during elections, but, you know, nothing more serious than that, right? And I think we've really seen over the past, 5 years, how just discussions of civic duty have exploded, really, because we're talking about us versus them politics, you know, citizens remaining committed to their democratic obligations, to democratic principles, even when the parties or the state seems to be not serving them, right? It's that kind of glue that really keeps democracies together when the going gets hard. And so I think, you know, civic duty has gone from this sort of nice to have descriptor to something that people are really recognizing as an essential ingredient to resilient democracies. You know, democracies that outlive crises like the financial crisis, like a lot of the tribalism politics that's plaguing a lot of democracies today. So to start thinking about what drives those types of informal foundations, I think is a very important discussion, really for the field going into sort of this next phase of democracy scholarship.
Thank you so much, Dr. Herr. That was really good and a good transition into our first audience question. That's going to sort of develop one of the ideas that you had just mentioned. So Sung Min Byun would like to ask, what can ordinary citizens do to prevent deeper fragmentation of current politics within the US and South Korea? And then I'll make a little addition there just to tie it into some of the concepts that you were discussing during your presentation. Can you talk about some of the ways that ordinary people get to contribute to the national story in ways that either strengthen or weaken civic duty and democratic institutions? So what, in a nutshell, what are normal people doing to participate in this process? And how does that go, up or down?
Great question. So, in order to prevent further national fragmentation, the first thing that ordinary citizens can do is be aware that it's happening, be aware of the consequences, right, to the democracy, and then use that knowledge at the ballot box, right? Hopefully what this lecture does, it kind of opens eyes to certain parties or, leaders that seem to kind of fan these types of divisions for electoral purposes. And when I said fragmentation incentivizes ordinary citizens to act as partisans first, Democrats second. One way to start to reverse that is to try to act as Democrats with a small d first. Before that is the enactment of civic duty. What can ordinary people do to contribute to the national story? I mean, the national story is made up of all of these stories that you might not even realize you're telling, stories that you tell about what it was like to grow up in South Korea at a certain time. You tell these stories to your children. Inadvertently, you are contributing to national stories. You're taking your lived experience as a Korean citizen living under the South Korean state through sort of a critical moment, right? And embedded in those stories, implicit in them are sort of passed down know-how. And some of those know-hows are constructive, right? They build positive relationships to the state. Others bear sort of the hurt, I would say, of past historical experiences. So one way to start to kind of shift the content of the national story, in particular, sort of the relationship that it builds to the state, is to start telling the kinds of national stories that you want your next generation, right? Your children, the next generation of the nation to learn. Right. So stories that emphasize positive interactions with, some kind of state public policy, positive experiences, for example, in the national military. These kinds of stories, experiences in the public education system, what that was like, what you learned. And we don't do this consciously. As I said, these aren't explicitly sort of told in a pedagogical way, but it is, I think, very important within a national community to be aware of what kind of sort of stylized stories we tell about our past, right? And whether that past reflects the kind of national future that we want our children to live in.
Thank you so much. You started your presentation with the discussion about how economics has such a big relationship to feeling of civic duty, the story of the IMF crisis and people going to bring their gold rings to donate to the central bank. So we have a couple of questions related to the relationship between economics and civic duty in South Korea. So first of all, Brian Kim wants to ask, what is Korea's future economic plans? You don't have to prognosticate on that. And how can Korean people and groups contribute to achieve its goals? So one way that we could approach this question is by thinking about how economic policy making can either complement or hurt the task of strengthening civic duty and democratic institutions. So that's one way to look at that question from Brian. And then I have a follow-up after that, but I think that's a big enough question to tackle on its own. The next one is related to large corporations and people's feeling of alienation. So maybe we could tackle that second. It's a little bit different from this one.
Sure. So, the question of how economics relates to civic duty for me, really goes back to the question of how do we build, in the face of growing economic inequalities, how do we build sort of an inclusive nationalism that builds positive attachments and positive interactions to the state, right? And I think, there is a lot of research on how you build inclusive nationalisms. Not as much in sort of how you start to do that in a transitional moment where you have an old relationship and, how do you change that? And that's really, I think, where the next phase of my research is headed, is more towards sort of policy solutions on, how do we change national narratives? But I want to do my best to answer this question. So in the existing research in the field about how to build inclusive nationalisms, a key part of that, and this, I'm referencing a book by a sociologist, Andreas Wimmer, on public goods provision. Right? Equal public goods provision that minimizes these kind of perceptions of inequality within what you're trying to make as the national group. So in terms of Korea's economic plan, a key thing that it has to address is this growing income inequality. Korea is one of the countries where redistribution falls far below the level of actual income gap. It's where the classic sort of Meltzer economic model does not really hold. If you graph those things, actually most East Asian democracies are outliers. They fall much below or below the regression line. And so, redistribution, I think, has to be a key policy agenda for South Korea going forward. But to be careful that redistribution is not necessarily only targeted at newcomers, right? Again, it has to walk this sort of delicate balance of trying to build and accommodate for more diversity while also being really careful not to alienate Native citizens who still hold on to this sort of older narrative. And so, yes, resources are limited. What it is to say is not, just build all of these new programs, but in the way that redistribution works, to be very aware of potential effects of helping one group or favoring one group over the other, that can do lasting damage to the civic foundations going forward, and to be aware of that in how you allocate scarce resources.
Wonderful, thank you. So our next question is from Phil and Brigitte Sherman, the wonderful sponsors of today's program. Their generosity, of course, makes this possible. So thank you, Phil and Brigitte. So they would like to ask about a top-down approach to the national story. So before we talked about, how do ordinary people get to contribute to it? And they would like to ask, can and should national leadership get involved in managing the story directly? Or is it a matter of having the right policies to support it?
I think national leadership is actually the most powerful mechanism through which states can start to shape the national story and mend broken relationships to the state for different groups. So, the state offering a very clear nationalist vision, regardless of what that is, right? So, this is kind of perhaps normatively troubling, but it's what comes out from the research is that in terms of building political loyalty or civic duty to the state, it doesn't really matter what the content of the national story is. What matters is that content is able to draw a sort of, a wide inclusive circle around a lot of the citizenry, and then link that citizenry in a mutually committed relationship to the state, right? So in some ways, authoritarian states have done this brilliantly through history, right? By inculcating citizens with sort of nationalist fervor, et cetera. They're very aware of how this works. We're very much less aware of how this works in democracies. So this is to say that I think democratic leaders need, instead of kind of shying away from anything nationalism, which is what a lot of them are doing, right? Because nationalism has gained this sort of very bad reputation that it's something that damages democracies. But in fact, if you use it correctly, right? If you use it to build committed relationships to the state, it can actually be, I think, an incredibly powerful, positive resource for democracies in the way that democracies precisely need, right? We need more civic duty because we can't coerce our citizens or threaten them to sacrifice for the state in times of need. So national leadership is key. The unity of the story between the parties is also key, right? Once the parties start to divide and become polarized on national identity, then you have a situation where national ownership of the state becomes unclear. People lose attachment. They feel like it's no longer their state when the other party is in power. We lose the flavor of democracy, right? So national leadership is key, but it needs to be followed with public policy, because the other side of the story is the actual lived experience of the people. So if you have all rhetoric on top of here, but no real follow through, and the stories that the parents tell their children about how the state treated people like us is not going to follow that rhetoric, right? So those two things do have to go together, but political leaders have a tremendous, I think, responsibility in guiding that direction.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I just want to add that Heyman G also asked a similar question about whether this phenomenon is nationally directed or grassroots directed. So just wanted to throw Heyman's name in there as well, but I feel like we have addressed that question. One thing that you mentioned that was interesting, I think provides a tidy little transition to an interesting question, which I know you're more than capable of handling because you have done work on North Korea in the past. So this question is from Luis Ma, and Luis would like to ask, how would you include North Korea in your reflection on national identity? What's the relationship there between the national leadership, developing the story, civic duty and obligation? You mentioned that it's really important. It doesn't matter so much what the messaging is, but what does matter is the policies are there to back it up. So North Korea, I think, is a really interesting case to examine in this regard.
So I'll say two things about how North Korea fits into this picture. One is sort of the story of civic duty within North Korea itself. So part of my research is really trying to actually break this assumption that civic duty is something that only exists in democracies, right? That leads to this sort of, I think, lazy wishful thinking that, just the more democratic you are or the older of a democracy you are, that civic duty is something that just kind of naturally happens. And, my work shows that that certainly is not the case, that civic duty can regress, and it's also not something that only exists in democracies. Perhaps we call civic duty in authoritarian regimes by a different name, political loyalty, blind allegiance, whatever you want to call it, but civic duty, in the sense of, this kind of obligatory attachment to the state, exists very much in authoritarian regimes like North Korea. And there's a reason why in North Korea, sort of the national story, of course, it's sort of frozen and it has taken on sort of a life of its own after the division, is so prominently featured as part of the regime. Right. That is, I believe, sort of an explicit effort to inculcate very strong loyalties of the kind that South Korea in its early days enjoyed, the sort of, part of the same bloodline. The Kim family is seen sort of in that way, right? Sort of the best representative of the bloodline. That kind of rhetoric is used very prominently within North Korea. There's another aspect of this, of how North Korea fits into South Korea's evolving national story. And this gets a little bit complicated, and I think South Korea perhaps needs to sort it out. But what I'm trying to say is, towards North Korea, South Korea does maintain this principle of co-nationality, right? North Koreans of the different groups of co-ethnic migrants is the only group that is able to apply for South Korean citizenship upon entry, right? So there is this enduring principle of co-nationality that has endured for many different reasons. I don't think it's just that we are, same bloodline and therefore that blinds everything. I don't think so. There are real political advantages to that co-national principle in dealing with foreign powers and dealing with political autonomy. So both Koreas have kept that alive. That really starts to get in the way, right? So Sheena Greitens and I had a piece on this a while ago in Foreign Policy, on how sort of South Korea's co-national principle towards North Koreans starts to really hinder its multicultural progress in other areas of immigration and migrant absorption. And so it's maintaining sort of this two-track principle. What it does is really actually, I think, fuel more fragmentation among South Korean citizens on where are we supposed to be going. So I think that certainly is something that needs a more unified national stance from, I think, the South Korean state.
Thank you very much. And this is another good transition. You seem to be dropping a lot of these good transitions. This question comes from Martina Amasene. Sorry, Martina, if I got that pronunciation wrong. So Martina's question is, what are policies you think South Korea should develop in order to integrate immigrants into society? And then my addition to that would be, in addition to immigration, can you also talk about South Korea's demographic pressures that you were describing earlier? Because I think this is such a key challenge for South Korea.
So I think those two things are obviously related, right? Immigration has become, I think, a growing necessity for South Korea going forward because precisely because of its demographic crisis, of which the fertility crisis is really the most pressing. So, sort of the South Korean government's stance to this has been to, provide local subsidies for foreign wives, interracial marriages. Multicultural families are still a very small portion of the general South Korean population, but over time are going to start to grow as the fertility crisis continues to worsen. So, what should the South Korean government do? The first thing, I think, that goes back to the importance, I think, of public goods provision being a key driver of building an inclusive national identity has to apply to immigrants, in particular foreign wives. So access to citizenship for foreign wives still very heavily depends. There have been recent changes to it, but still heavily depends on staying married to the native Korean husband. It's just a very long and difficult process to citizenship that mothers of now Korean children should have better access to. That is sort of a foundational kind of, we don't think of citizenship really as a public good necessarily, but that is sort of the first signal that, in terms of when we think about building nation state relationship, the first signal is to have that legal access to membership, right? But beyond that, when we think about sort of social integration, as I mentioned, sort of in closing, multicultural centers for foreign wives are, I think, great in principle. I think in practice, what they end up doing is actually kind of reifying a national hierarchy whereby foreign wives are expected to learn Korean customs, culture, language, but not really appreciate the diversity that they bring to those said Korean cultures and languages, right? And that's not what multiculturalism is, really. So these multicultural centers, which they're called Kamuna centers, I think in practice are more sort of assimilationist than the intention is, right? So that's what I meant by bonding versus bridging social capital. The sociologists in the room will recognize this. It's not just about giving foreign wives a community that they can feel like they belong to, but actually bridging that community with the natives and the locals, right? That's how you start to build feelings of inclusiveness. There has been recent research that, again, personal stories of immigration in the U.S. Can open people's hearts and minds towards immigrants. Now, South Korea is, perhaps doesn't really have an immigration story, but we certainly have a feeling of outsider story in its history, right? So I think emphasizing, those types of conversations either at school, in the public education system, or actually through entertainment media. So, the shows with the North Korean refugees, I mean, that has been, I think, has had a tremendous impact on how people think about North Korea, as well as refugees, et cetera. That can be a very powerful tool, sort of a cultural tool to build integration. One other thing, since I know this is what the policy folks want to think about, is so Emmanuel Macron a couple of years ago mentioned sort of reviving the national service system, right? As a way to sort of revive civic duty. And I think the Korean military system should actually perhaps be, so North Korean refugees can't serve in that, even if they want to, for obvious, perhaps security reasons. But, and it doesn't have to be the military per se, but some kind of national service system that all youth go through. Where they are sort of interacting with friends from other groups that they typically would not interact with in the name of service to the state, right? I think that is an incredibly powerful way to start to not only build civic duty, but really build it in a way that directs it positively in a supportive manner to the democratic state. So those are some ideas. Again, that's sort of, I think, the next turn in my research is to really go out and start to test those ideas.
Wonderful. Yeah, and your description of personal stories being so important, my mind went immediately to Minari. And I don't know who could come out of that movie not feeling tremendous sympathy for that family. Doesn't hurt. That was a fantastic movie on top of that. I wanted to ask a follow-up question about that graph that you showed us, where from 2010 to 2020, we saw an increase of people who say, I don't know, in terms of multiculturalism or homogenous ethnic makeup as defining Koreanism. But we also saw a drop in terms of people who supported a multi-ethnic society. So, and a pretty significant one, right? Not a small one. So what do you think accounts for that?
You have a fantastic memory. So it dropped from 60% in 2010 to right around 40, right, a little bit less than 45%. So that is a significant drop. And I think what is driving that is precisely sort of the dynamics that I talked about of feelings of alienation from the state. So multiculturalism, in theory, I think people are supportive of, and I think a lot of people recognize, especially in the younger generation, that is the direction inevitably that the country has to go. Once you see a lot of your tax dollars going into multicultural programs, and the problem is that social welfare protections in South Korea on a relative scale are pretty thin, right? And so once you start to face real problems like unemployment, like being able to provide for your parents, et cetera. But you see sort of the state, in rhetoric as well as devotion of the GDP going a lot more into these multicultural programs to foreigners, to immigrants. I think it starts to spark these feelings of, wait a second, right? I thought the state represented people like me, right? I thought the state represented a particular vision of Korea to which I belong. And then all of a sudden I feel like it's starting to shift in this different direction. And I don't know if I'm ready for that. So I think that's what you're seeing. That's when sort of immigration, like foreign wife, immigration levels really start to go up is between the 2010s to now. And so I think concurrent with that, you're seeing sort of this backlash to very proactive state efforts to make that shift. So, I kind of see it as growing pains of a transitional moment. the important thing is to recognize that it is in that transitional moment, and that it comes with real democratic, lasting democratic consequences, right?
Thank you very much. Let's go to a question from Jules Luce. Jules asks, do religious movements play a role in commitment to democracy? And as soon as I saw this, I started thinking about Poland during the Cold War and the role of the Catholic Church. But perhaps in the case of Korea, have you looked into this at all, and more generally?
So I have not looked into how religion would interact with nationalism in the South Korean case, but I know Professor Kang has some early work on this that I have read that I thought was incredibly interesting. But to answer that question sort of more broadly, I think definitely religion is religion is one other way through which nationalism can manifest. And so we see this in India under Modi, for example, right now with Hindu nationalism, right? So nationalism in Korea has taken more of a sort of ethnic flavor so far, but I think there's a lot of room for religious movements to play. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, again, depends, right? Most people think that ethnic nationalisms or religious nationalisms inevitably lead to sort of fanatic destabilization, anti-democratic values, because they tend to be exclusive. Any kind of nationalism is exclusive, right? Civic nationalisms are exclusive of people who do not share those political ideals and values. So again, I really want to emphasize it's not really about what is sort of the content of the nationalism per se when it comes to civic duty and how nationalisms, whether they manifest in supportive or sort of in opposition to democracies. It's really that historicized relationship with the state. So if there is a strong religion-based nationalism that is broadly inclusive of the citizenry, and the state reflects a supportive relationship to that nationalism, then that can actually be a good thing in terms of generating civic duty. When that religious nationalism starts to exclude certain growing groups from political power in the state, starts to explicitly threaten them, as we're seeing in the case of India, then we run into real problems for that religious nationalism and democracy. So in the case of South Korea, obviously, Christianity is a huge part of religious activity. If that were to get more politicized than it is, I think it would really have to. We would really have to see how whether or not it manifests in sort of a broadly inclusive way, or if it starts to really draw hard lines of exclusion against, LGBT or different minority groups. And that would be the determining factor, not the fact that it's a religious nationalism per se, that then shapes its relationship to South Korea's democracy.
This is so interesting and a great framework for thinking about lots of different countries throughout history. It's just really compelling stuff. Last question, and then we're going to commence with the award giving, which is well-deserved after a marathon of really detailed answers. So this is about economics again and the role of larger corporations. So Luis Ma asks, your analysis seems to focus on the fractured nation-state relationship, which seems to be very much about economic inclusion. We know that big businesses are at the core of the Korean economic system. How do they play a role in mending this feeling of alienation? And then Leslie Perez sort of asks the inverse of that, which is, growing socioeconomic disparity in South Korea, how does that lead to a breakdown of feelings of civic duty and the national story?
Oh, those are fantastic questions. And they're big questions. So I'm trying to think how exactly to break it down a bit. So, the main thing and I think the two are actually related because the big corporation in South Korea were a tremendous force behind its development, but then also have contributed to growing inequality and feeling, sort of the division of the lives of the haves versus the have-nots in South Korea. The issue with growing inequality, as I said, is not just the fact that the inequality is so high or growing. It's and therefore I'm mad because that person or that CEO has more than I do. It's not just that, right? In the same way that anti-immigrant protests are not just about xenophobia. Maybe to a certain extent they are, but that's not really what's driving it. The way that income inequality and sort of the dominance of big corporations fractures nation-state relationship for sort of the majority of the people is that they feel like, hey, my father or I worked really hard during the 1980s to build South Korea's national economic success to where it is today, right? I gave that sacrifice. And now all of a sudden, right, with economic liberalization, there are less protections from global competition. My father lost his job during the IMF crisis, and hasn't really been able to get back on his foot since then. These kinds of stories, and the state didn't really come to help. For example, right, the unemployment, unemployment still remains a huge and sort of unsolved crisis for the country. These kinds of national stories, what they start to do is they start to build this deep feeling of being left behind, of being carved out, was I think the term that I used, of the national achievement that I had sacrificed or that my family sacrificed to build, right? That is a much deeper sense of alienation from the state, almost a sense of betrayal from the state, by the state, than simply, hey, I'm angry or jealous that that person has more than I do. And it has, more far-reaching consequences politically, because those kinds of feelings and frames don't go away very easily, especially when they are passed down through generations. It starts to build a certain perception of the state as something that doesn't care about my kind of people, my group, right? So that sort of idealistic story that I started with of South Korea's ethnic nationalism, sort of homogenizing across classes, as well as building this sort of very sturdy link to the state, starts to fall apart. So, it is growing income inequality is the problem, but it's really how people are affected by that on an identity level, on a political alienation level, that really starts to affect civic duty. So it's, the claim here is not that if you go to a democracy and there's growing income inequality, that necessarily civic duty will be harmed. It's really in South Korea's particular case, sort of the big rise through the 1980s and 90s, and then sort of the collapse of those state protections and what that did to a lot of the working class. Right?
Really interesting. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Senior Director Stephen Noerper, Dr. Stephen Noerper. He's a professor at Columbia University, and of course he helped to lead the creation of this series, the Sherman Scholar series, and it's going to be his pleasure to present the award to you. So I turn it over to Stephen.
Thank you, Jonathan, and for that kind moderation. And also, I was very impressed your invocation about Solidarność in Poland. And it's important to remember that the Catholic Church during the democratic transition in Korea provided sanctuary, vital sanctuary, to democratic activists in Korea. So interesting stories. Aram, you did an amazing job both with the presentation as well as with handling a bevy of questions. And thank you to all of you who submitted those. We're impressed to have almost 300 people online as we speak, and there will be many hundred more watching via YouTube or listening via audio podcast download. Jonathan and I would now like to formally present you with the Sherman Scholar Award in its physical manifest. and you also have the a monetary prize with that, courtesy of Phil and Birgitta Sherman. So congratulations, Aram, and thank you for your brilliance today. I'd also like to extend special thanks, of course, to Tom Byrne, to Jonathan Corrado, and to Peter Stemke, as well as Claire Callahan of the Korea Society team. All have put great thought leadership, logistics, audio, and communication support towards making this series happen. Of course, to Phil and Birgitta Sherman for their continued largesse. They supported an anniversary conference marking the transition from 1987 back in 2017, beyond their generosity around this Korea Emerging Scholar Lecture Series. So thank you for that. And also to thank my very dear friends, in particular, Katrin Katz, and really wishing her and her family the very best. And to thank Katrin as our inaugural recipient and for introducing Aram Herr today. And to thank my dear friend, Professor Dave Kong, who does so much to raise the torch, both in terms of what happens at USC and the broader Korean studies community, but also through his brilliant writings, which have been critical for my classes at Columbia. And of course, Dave and Victor Cha run a very wonderful series for Columbia University Press. So highly recommended to all of you. Again, thank you all for joining, and really a virtual round of applause to Aram Herr. Aram, good luck in every endeavor and everything that you do here with this, and for really taking the time today to enlighten us on a critical issue at a critical time, both for Korea and, as has been pointed out, internationally. Thank you all for joining, and please see the Korea Society at koreasociety.org for membership and more. Stay safe, healthy, and Aram Herr, thank you.
Thank you so much.